Donald Trump has completed his decisive victory in the US presidential election.
Hello, and welcome to Mortal Giants, a podcast about the fragility of power in the 21st century. I'm Sandy Garossino.
And I'm Vina Nadjibulla. This podcast is produced in collaboration with Canada's National Observer.
Trump and the post-American world.
Well, I want to thank you all very much. This is great. These are our friends. We have thousands of friends on this incredible movement. Frankly, this was, I believe, the greatest political movement of all time. There's never been anything like this in this country and maybe beyond.
Here we are, Vina. This is our first podcast that we've recorded after the November 5th election in which Donald Trump was reelected as president of the United States. And it feels in a way like the world has shifted on its axis and that enormous changes are ahead for all of us everywhere. What did you think as you watched everything unfold and with your view of the international scene?
Well, 2024 is a mega year for elections.
More than half the global population is heading to the polls in a groundbreaking year of elections.
The U.S. election was always going to be the most consequential because of the outsized role that the U.S. plays in global affairs and foreign policy, and what happens in the U.S. has an impact for everyone, for all of humanity and for the future of the planet. So you're absolutely right. I think we have crossed the Rubicon. This is going to be a really challenging and difficult 4 years for anyone who cares about alliances, for anyone who cares about climate change, for those of us who care about rule of law, democracy, human rights. Those issues are going to come under a lot of strain, as will international trade. And I think for Canada in particular, that's going to be really probably the hardest thing to manage is how does Canada, as a trading nation, continue to rely on trade with others while North America and the U.S. becomes increasingly more protectionist and closed off. But there are many things that we can unpack. I mean, this really is going to be a very different 4 years. We've entered an experiment of some sort, and I don't really know, and I don't think anybody really knows what exactly will happen.
Well, one of the things that's interesting is that we do have some foreshadowing of what will happen because we've had a previous Trump administration. And many commentators have made the observation that a lot of his first administration was hindered in a lot of ways by senior people from military to the Attorney General, Department of Justice. There were a lot more binding ties that were limiting him. And what we saw certainly after the 2020 election in the closing weeks of his administration, when he shed a lot of those individuals, he loosened everything. So I think that we have a little bit of a sense of what his impulses are and his priorities. Let's look at what a lot of the focus is right now. Putin, Ukraine, and Trump's announcement that, he thinks he can make a deal virtually overnight. So what do you see on that front?
Sure. I'll get to Russia and Ukraine in a second, but maybe just to the broader point that you were making, that while we saw Trump 1 presidency, Trump 2 will be different for a number of reasons. One, the reason that you mentioned, that personnel is going to be very different. In the first Trump administration, we did have a lot of career, seasoned experts and senior officials who, as you said, were often in a position to limit some of the worst impulses. It will be a different story this time around. Obviously, President Trump prizes the idea of being unpredictable. He feels that that's actually kind of a
strategic
advantage, precisely. But beyond the fact that he's going to want to do things that are personally and financially beneficial to him, it's unclear what his policies will look like. That's in part because there are different parts of the Republican Party that are vying for certain positions and have different views. I mean, I guess kind of two big camps when it comes to foreign policy would be the realists and the isolationist libertarians. And the realists would want kind of a muscular U.S. foreign policy that focuses on China as the primary threat.
In some ways, this is sort of almost the curtain coming down on the post-war liberal,
International
democratic,
order, yes.
international order, rules-based international order. This is sort of the end of that.
I mean, it's accelerating the end of it. I wouldn't say that we're already at the end, but I think it would be fair to say that Trump's election will accelerate all the trends towards a more fragmented, more contested, more multipolar world, rather than a world in which the U.S. has been the dominant power.
I think this is the first time India, New Zealand, Australian foreign ministers are actually going to be on a stage together and discussing a common future. Is it a grouping that needs to now, in many ways, become more active in the days ahead?
I have a big question, which is who runs the world? It used to be an easy question to answer.
It always has struck me as kind of counterintuitive that somebody like Trump, who is so attached to power and dominance and global dominance, would at the same time be willing and in some ways eager to preside over the end of America as the dominant nation in the world by far. Do you have any feeling on what he's...
He probably doesn't see it that way. I mean, this is the unfortunate thing. I think he actually probably believes that he wants to make America great again. But ultimately, I think he probably doesn't care so much about global dominance as about personal gain. And because if you really look at the policies, including, for instance, tariffs, it's incoherent because on some level, President Trump won because of affordability crisis and because of inflation and the fact that
tariffs will undermine that.
The policy of tariffs will, according to all economists, actually make costs of living more of a challenge rather than address it. So I don't think there's necessarily consistency there. And again, other people are better positioned to explain why the U.S. voted the way they have. And I've been really struck by the analysis of people like Ezra Klein, who obviously very much a progressive Democrat, but who is analyzing how it's really the Democrats who lost rather than Trump who won. But again, that's outside of my purview. What I focus on is what does this mean really for the U.S., especially for the U.S. foreign policy and especially for U.S. allies around the world. Because if you kind of look at in the world, again, broadly speaking, countries who have for the last, let's say, 10, 15 years pursued a policy of strategic autonomy, of a multi-vector foreign policy, of hedging and balancing, they will be better off.
They'll be the beneficiaries of
they'll
this
be
election.
better in this
And which countries
environment.
are those?
So India comes to mind, Indonesia, Brazil, all of the larger countries that are not security allies of the U.S., who in the past were non-aligned during the Cold War, but who now are multi-aligned or are pursuing this independent foreign policy that is trying to maximize their strategic autonomy in a world where you have U.S. and China in a competition for a more dominant position. Countries that have been U.S. security allies, both through NATO but also in Asia, are going to be in a more difficult situation. In Asia, it will be Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Taiwan, Australia. They would be now in a position to try to figure out how to maintain some of the structures that the Biden administration really put in place.
Well, the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has released a statement congratulating Donald Trump on what he calls his impressive victory. And he said, "I appreciate President Trump's commitment to the peace through strength approach in global affairs. This is exactly the principle that can practically bring just peace in Ukraine closer. I'm hopeful that we will put it into action together."
Let's just go back to Ukraine and Russia and Putin for now.
Yeah.
How do you see that relationship unfolding now? Because Trump, it seems like he wants to close the book on the Ukraine conflict. What do you see happening and what will be the influences of how that situation unfolds?
So I think Trump's re-election is really bad news for Ukraine. And most Ukrainians have known this. I mean, President Zelensky is going to put on a brave face and say all the right and necessary things, but this is really bad news. It's bad news because Trump has made it clear that he wants to end the war, and he wants to end the war on terms that I think will be broadly agreeable to Putin and really devastating for Ukraine and for its future. We are likely to see some kind of a land for peace formula where the parts of Ukraine that are now illegally occupied by Russia will likely go to Russia. And then it'll be really discussions on other terms, whether or not the rest of Ukraine will have any security guarantees, whether it would have any pathway to NATO. And nobody can really predict what those negotiations will look like. But I think Putin is certainly going to try to play hardball and get as much as he can, which means no future NATO for Ukraine, even in a diminished size, no security guarantees, essentially what Putin has wanted all along, which is to get territory, to have a land access to the Black Sea, and to make sure that Ukraine is never really fully integrated into Europe and into the Western alliance. I think some of the factors that will determine whether or not that is in fact the outcome will also be Europe and what European Union and other allies, including Canada, Japan, and others, are able to do to bolster Ukraine's position in these negotiations. But I think if Ukraine is probably the biggest loser, European Union would be the second biggest loser from this election, because President Trump has shown a lot of hostility towards the European Union and the concept of a united Europe, and has no interest to deal with Brussels and EU as a bloc. He prefers to work bilaterally with certain European leaders, like the president of Hungary,
Orban, and to divide and conquer. And,
precisely.
And
So I think a lot will depend on whether or not Europe is able to unite in the way that, the French president is now saying, well, if it's America first, then we also need to have Europe first approach. Let's see. Whether that's where we will end up, or whether Europe, in fact, will try to manage U.S. bilaterally. So there are many question marks. And what happens in Ukraine and the kind of settlement that's reached in Ukraine will then have broader implications for Asia, for the Indo-Pacific, for how China then pursues its policies towards Taiwan. So it's unfortunate because, as I was mentioning earlier, there are some Republicans who believe that ending the war in Ukraine is actually necessary to be able to focus on China.
Yeah.
But I'm afraid China will take all the wrong lessons from this. And this will embolden China and actually make U.S. seem like an unreliable ally to Taiwan, to the Philippines, who need the U.S. backing to be able to stand up to China.
Weakening Taiwan's grip, I would imagine, a big concern for reasons that we've talked about. Most of all, the advanced microchip technology, which seems to be housed almost in its entirety in Taiwan, and China getting control of that, or being able to assert dominance there, is an enormous national security risk to the United States, is it not? So let's talk about China and Taiwan. I mean, can Trump afford to let China continue its tightening the grip on Taiwan?
It would be not in the U.S. interest, and there are many serious consequences. You mentioned, obviously, the semiconductors and the dominant role that Taiwan plays on that, but it's beyond that. It's also freedom of navigation, ship lanes, it's that whole
supply
sort of access, supply chains. Taiwan being annexed by China will have devastating consequences for U.S. national security and economic interests, as well as for allies like Japan, like the Philippines, and everyone else, and
in a way that Ukraine does not represent the same
not
risk.
to the U.S. I mean, it does to
Europe,
democracy, and to Europe, and obviously it undermines rule of law. But as we said earlier, President Trump doesn't care about that, and many people who voted for him, I don't think, also care particularly about global institutions or international rules-based order. It is unfortunate because that international rules-based order has underpinned U.S. prosperity and global prosperity and living standards of all of those people. But often people vote not on policies that are best for them, but on emotions and narratives and other sentiments. So that's what we'll see. It's a especially difficult moment for countries that in the last 4 years made a big bet on the Biden administration's push for these minilaterals and new security structures in the Indo-Pacific. Philippines comes to mind. Philippines really in the last 4 years made a big pivot to align with the US, with Japan, with Australia. And the future of those minilaterals now is a little bit more in question. A lot, again, will depend whether other countries are able to step up. So whether Australia, Japan, India can sustain those cooperative structures and arrangements like the Quad or AUKUS or Squad, which involves the Philippines together with the US, Australia, and Japan.
Japanese Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba hoped Sunday's election would strengthen his leadership. Instead, his coalition fell far short of a majority, weakening his position.
And the party that has ruled Japan with interruptions only 2 times, they were not in power since the World War II. And right now, they just had a devastating election just a month ago. So Japan is also going through domestic political turmoil.
President Duterte, I speak to you on behalf of 350 million Americans with a message of friendship and partnership. I'm here to advance peace, to promote security, and to work with you to achieve a truly free and open Indo-Pacific, where we are proud and we have sovereign nations.
I'm really, really curious about how someone with Trump's mindset is going to see the Indo-Pacific. What you're kind of signaling is the Indo-Pacific is going to, China, Taiwan, and the Pacific region is going to rise in prominence, perhaps in a way that even despite all of the attention that we've given it in the past, it may be becoming much more strategically important. And how does someone like Donald Trump view this? Is this an opportunity? Is this a moment when he can really be muscular? He has been unafraid to sort of confront China in the past.
Yes.
And Xi Jinping is in some ways a more diminished figure than he was in 2016 because of the economic headwinds that China is now facing. How do you see this?
So I think with China, a key issue is going to be tariffs and trade. On that issue, we probably will see some kind of a return to the trade war that Trump launched in his first administration. Again, it depends on some personnel, but it seems like Bob Lighthizer will very likely come back to the same role that he had in the previous administration. And he's very much dedicated to ensuring that the trade war with China continues and intensifies. I think on that side, we're clear. The second element is technology. And on this, it'll be interesting to see whether the Trump administration continues the restrictions and the policy that the Biden administration put into place. There will probably be some tension with some personalities that are now close to President Trump that were not in the picture during the first administration when Trump did sort of pursue more aggressive policies towards China. So, and I'm thinking about the tech bros and all the folks who are more interested in ensuring a lot more collaboration and interactions and engagement with China in those sectors. So trade, he'll be tough on again, and we'll likely see the 60% tariffs that have been promised on the campaign's trail. On technology, less clear. Again, will really depend to see what happens with people like Elon Musk and others who are close to Trump now, who have their own personal and corporate interests. And then on Taiwan, I think that's where really some big question marks now exist, because in the first administration, there were people in the Trump team that really were committed to Taiwan's defense and independent status. We're not yet sure whether those people will end up in the second Trump administration. And President Trump himself has said some things that have been much more worrisome this time around in terms of Taiwan sort of stealing the semiconductors from the U.S. and Taiwan not doing enough to defend itself. So he has certainly put in a condition that Taiwan needs to spend 5% of its GDP on its own defense and buy more defense technology and defense capabilities from the U.S. He has also really generally, like with so many other things, has approached Taiwan kind of from a transactional place.
Well, this gets back to, Donald Trump, it's the art of the deal. This is the guy who is, at his core, this is about deal making, and he's not necessarily
He doesn't seem to care about Taiwan as a self-governing democracy where 24 million people live freely. So he sees Taiwan as a bargaining chip vis-a-vis China rather than as a place on its own.
And one of the things that's interesting to me about this is we heard during the campaign, I think Mike Johnson indicated that maybe the CHIPS Act was going to get repealed. But the CHIPS Act was actually about injecting a huge amount of capital into rebuilding America's manufacturing prowess and to onshore the manufacturing of microchips and hopefully even advanced microchips. And a lot of those factories, by the way, went into
Republican states.
Yes. That was a strategic play, I think, by Joe Biden to ensure that those manufacturing projects would proceed and those factories would open and those jobs would be there, a way of sort of inoculating the CHIPS Act. Do you think that the CHIPS Act is going to go, or is Trump going to see, no, I like this, and we need to have this capacity here, and this frees me from having to defend Taiwan?
It's interesting because I think the question is broader than that. How many elements of Bidenomics will continue, particularly with the industrial policies that were put in place? And it's connected to earlier questions. So when the Biden administration came into power, I think they tried to do everything possible to maintain the U.S.-led kind of liberal international order and to connect domestic and foreign policy, right? So the sentiment was that this kind of uncontrolled globalization was not good for certain segments of the U.S. population, and therefore we needed a foreign policy for the middle class. I'm sure you remember all of those slogans, right? And the foreign policy for the middle class meant a lot more industrial policy. So the CHIPS Act, IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, and the focus on a green economy, and then building and reforming international institutions to also focus on green economy and infrastructure support and all of that, right? So it was in some ways because when the Biden administration came into power, they could already see the decline of that system that was in place, both its economic underpinnings, which was very much about free trade and trade liberalization and investment liberalization. So they were already trying to find ways to kind of shore up the system and were experimenting. I mean, let's be clear, this was also an experiment of some sort. And I'm not sure the Trump administration will have the same need or desire to do that, right? To maintain a system or to find ways to make it still work in the new era by focusing it on de-risking from China, decarbonization, and reindustrialization and bringing back manufacturing to the U.S. to kind of shore up the Rust Belt, right? And to make it the focus on green economy, kind of new manufacturing. There's a question mark to what extent any of that will continue. I mean, certainly it won't continue for the same reasons. So even if Trump administration maintains some of the policies of IRA, let's say, right, it would be largely because potentially of its economic gain, especially to those red states, rather than because of a conviction that climate change needs to be addressed. I think it's anyone's guess at this point, but I would imagine that majority of them will go through some kind of a change, not least because the one commitment that has been made and will likely be followed through on is a reform of kind of the entire public sector, right? And cutting down of government spending and public spending. And that will have implications for U.S. foreign policy as well, because, as I said, in the last 4 years, there were so many linkages between foreign and domestic policy.
Arab and Muslim leaders are in Saudi Arabia's capital to discuss Israel's wars on Gaza and Lebanon. The talks are being hosted by Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. In his opening speech, he condemned Israel's attacks on Gaza and Lebanon.
We call on the international community to uphold its responsibility to maintain international peace and security by immediately ending the Israeli aggression against our brothers in Palestine and Lebanon.
It's hard to imagine that there's a path to an independent Palestine anywhere soon. What do you see are the implications for the region, for Netanyahu's strategy, for the people of Gaza, the West Bank, and more broadly in the region itself, Iran, Saudi Arabia, generally in the region?
I think any restrictions that were possible under a potential Harris administration on Israel's ambitions now with respect to Gaza or even more generally Iran and Lebanon, those will not be a factor now. I don't think President Trump will have any desire to limit or restrict Netanyahu government in Israel. So this does give Israel a lot more freedom of maneuver, which, to be fair, broadly Netanyahu has enjoyed in the last year as well, although there has been some pressures.
Nobody has publicly held him
to account.
But
there have been some efforts and certainly kind of statements made in support of finding some kind of a humane way out of this and respecting humanitarian law and the laws of war, all of those things. I think that focus will disappear. The area that's kind of more interesting to me than Israel, which I think, like I said, will get a lot more support for all of its maximalist objectives in the region, is what Trump might do with Iran. I mean, he's so unpredictable and kind of has this desire to do things that are really surprising. One of the more surprising things he can do is have talks with Iran in the way that he did with North Korea, right? I don't put that, I mean, obviously it's an extreme idea, but very much also in the style of a president who's unpredictable and sees himself as the chief negotiator or the best negotiator out there. So some kind of a negotiation with Iran is not out of the question. But of course, any serious negotiation with Iran, just like any serious negotiation with North Korea, requires real hard work and substantive discussions, which don't seem to be high on the agenda for President Trump. So he might announce something and there could be a lot of publicity in the same way that we had with North Korea a few years back, but nothing substantive will come out of it because I don't think he'd be interested in any actual real negotiation.
I mean, I'm kind of, as you're talking about this, I'm actually thinking to myself, well, what does the Revolutionary Guard think of all of this? I mean, is there a play here for the Revolutionary Guard to make some kind of deal themselves?
I think
they really are the center of power in Iran.
Yeah.
I mean, the clerics don't, if the Revolutionary Guard doesn't want to do something.
I think one thing that's clear is for anyone who sees the U.S. as an adversary or who's interested in dividing and weakening the U.S., they see this election outcome or this result of Trump 2.0 as good news. I mean, there are many things on which we are unclear, but it would be fair to say that U.S. adversaries, all the leaders or fractions around the world who would like to see a weakened and divided the United States are happy with this outcome. That extends to President Putin, that extends to leaders in Iran, in the same way that those of us who care about alliances, who care about democracy and international law will find the next 4 years challenging. The opposite camp is going to find this much more of a comfortable world to operate in, where the most powerful country in the world, the United States, doesn't seem to care about things that it has built over 70 years.
I mean, Iran has been so substantially weakened and actually exposed as a much weaker party. It was not able to defend Hezbollah in Lebanon. It has not really won this confrontation at all. It's significantly diminished. And I'm sure that people like Mohammed bin Salman are just rubbing their hands together with glee at the idea of a diminished Iran. Where do you see their opportunities now?
Yes, Iran has been diminished, and it certainly looks like it's not able to support its proxies in Lebanon. But I don't think Iran has given up its ambitions to become a nuclear power.
Exactly.
I think Iran and Russia are cooperating much more closely together. I think Iran and China are cooperating much more closely together. And Iran as a potential nuclear power is still a big threat to Israel and to others in the region.
Do you see Netanyahu fixing his sights on Iran's nuclear infrastructure and capacity?
I mean, that certainly is very much in discussion. And whether or not that will be the next move, I think, is a real good question. But notwithstanding the fact that Iran has been exposed as being much weaker and unable to really meet the escalation that Israel has sort of launched against it, it still remains a threat. And I think the closer security cooperation and linkages between Russia and Iran and China are also of concern. And when we talked about the fact that U.S. alliance structure is going to be weakened, that actually is a big issue for the U.S. and countries like Canada in terms of being able to continue to maintain our own safety and prosperity. And by the same token, I think in the next few years, the axis of upheaval will be strengthened. They're not going to see this and say, oh, so alliances are out of style.
Yes.
I think, in fact, they're
going to say, it's our turn to shine.
Exactly. It's our turn to build something else and to step into the spaces that the U.S. is going to abandon, be that around the climate change agenda, so the COP process through the United Nations, be that around kind of peacemaking and smaller regional conflicts, or even in reforming institutions, the United Nations or the World Bank, International Monetary Fund, all of those things, right? I mean, even, for instance, just next week, later in November, we're going to have meetings of the G20 chaired by Brazil. And President Biden and President Lula had agreed on a number of things, including this big initiative that Brazil is launching on dealing with hunger and poverty. Well, you can be certain that come January, U.S. is going to pull out of that.
That's
it
done.
is finished. Same thing with the APEC, which is dealing with Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, a big gathering that focuses on trade and in economic integration and technology. So President Biden was actually not going to go for these meetings next week. Since the election results became known, he's now decided to go actually to Peru to participate in these meetings, which is great. But again, no one is going to have any confidence that whatever U.S. agrees to at this meeting, that will be honored come January.
He's the lamest of ducks at this point.
And in those meetings, the contrast is going to be really stark between China that shows up in Peru to open the biggest port, a mega port in Peru.
Will allow giant ships with cargoes of more than 20,000 containers to dock. And the traveling time to and from China reduced from 45 to 10 days. It's a $3.5 billion investment project that experts say will transport 1 million containers the first year.
To continue to deepen trade and investment with whole of Latin America and a United States, which is going to become protectionist and abandon all trade, international trade and investment frameworks.
Represented by an aging man who's literally, he almost represents physically, visibly, the
decline
and ending of the American century.
As Ottawa announces its Team Canada approach to the second Trump presidency, provinces are also preparing for what's to come.
Trump is vowing to impose across-the-board import tariffs and reopen NAFTA, launch a mass deportation operation, raising fears of an exodus to Canada, and encourage Russia to attack any NATO ally that doesn't hit the alliance's defense spending targets. Canada is 8 years away from doing so.
Where does this leave Canada? What does the future hold for us under a Trump administration?
I mean, there are going to be a few key areas or key issues that we would need to deal with. Trade is going to be obviously one of the most dominant pillars of the discussion, and that's to do with the renegotiations of NAFTA 2.0 or CUSMA or USMCA, which is coming up. But I think more broadly, the issue is if the U.S. is becoming more and more protectionist, and most of our trade is with the U.S., 78%, whatever, less than 80%. But at the same time, we want to continue to be open and engage in free trade with the rest of the world. Can we actually do that? Can Canada basically have full access and full integration with the U.S. and continue to trade with the rest of the world as the U.S. becomes more protectionist? I think those are going to be some hard choices. We already saw that with the tariffs on Chinese-made EVs, and that's just the beginning. There's going to be a lot more of that. So really difficult for Canada as a trading nation, country that prides itself for having the most free trade agreements among any G7 countries, to be able to square that circle. So that's on that, and it's going to preoccupy many in Ottawa and across Canada because it's an existential issue for us. Then, of course, there is the immediate issue of refugee flows or borders and dealing with the 12 million or so people that President Trump
promises to expel, and not
so,
all of them will go south.
No, I would imagine not. And a lot of them preemptively could choose to start to migrate north in anticipation of these policies.
Potentially even, making refugee claims that they're refugees from the United States.
Because so much of my time is devoted to looking at Canada-Asia relations, I think an important implication for us is also with respect to India. Canada, as you know, as we've discussed, is in this very public, very big diplomatic dispute with India.
Canadian Chargé d'Affaires Stuart Wheeler was summoned to the Indian Ministry of External Affairs on Monday, one of 6 diplomats kicked out of that country.
Canada has provided credible, irrefutable evidence of ties between agents of the government of India and a murder of a Canadian citizen on Canadian soil.
We have enjoyed some private support from the Biden administration. And I think longer term, we thought that the Biden policy
there would be
of asking for accountability, accountability, justice. We essentially had a like-minded government in the U.S. that was pursuing, maybe in a different way, more private, but nonetheless, there was pressure on India to show some movement toward accountability and addressing this issue. I think with the Trump presidency, there will be no focus on that element. There are many things about India,
In
U.S.
fact, I imagine that Donald Trump would be perfectly happy to have Modi have a free hand with...
Well, when it comes to human rights and transnational repression, I think it won't be a priority for the Trump administration. Yeah. They will focus much more on India as a counterbalance to China, and they will focus on their own bilateral issues. So Trump is not happy about trade issues with respect to India. He finds that India is very protectionist and closed off. And so there will be points of friction between a Trump administration and India, especially on issues around immigration and trade. But on issues of transnational repression, I think Trump is going to essentially give a free pass. And that will have ramifications for us because Canada will then be standing alone, truly alone in its fight with a democracy of 1.4 billion people, namely India.
It's an interesting dynamic. And to the extent that personalities weigh in on all of these things, and we've seen how the personality and the background of Xi Jinping has shaped modern China as it is emerging today, or as it's maturing and really flexing its muscles internationally. And Donald Trump is absolutely a personality. I mean, this is someone who's governed by his own personal impulses in a way that, other leaders might be influenced by data and previous commitments and so on. Has Justin Trudeau run out of friends in the world? He's persona non grata in India. Xi Jinping has no time for him. Putin has no time for him. And I don't imagine that Donald Trump has any time for him. So where does Justin Trudeau find international political capital to advance Canada's priorities?
Yeah, I mean, I would look at it more broadly rather than focusing on the current prime minister here in Canada, focus more on whether or not Canada will have bandwidth to deal with the rest of the world, given the kind of the existential crisis that we find ourselves in with respect to our relationship with the U.S. and potential changes to the U.S. that will have immediate impacts on Canada. So much of our attention always has been on the U.S. relationship, but now with Trump 2.0, will there be any bandwidth left to continue to pursue our Indo-Pacific strategy and do something with Japan and South Korea and Taiwan and Philippines and try to mend the relationship with India? Will we still have the capacity to really look at what's happening in NATO and stay on the same page with Europe as Europe tries to shore up Ukraine in the absence of the U.S. as the main supporter? So I think that's a bigger question to me. And of course, my hope would be that precisely because U.S. is now much more unreliable, much more unpredictable, Canada needs to deepen its relationships with other allies, especially other democracies in Asia and in Europe, and have a more engaged and smart and strategic approach to the rest of the world, Latin America, Africa. Again, bandwidth, I keep coming back to that.
Capacity. We are a small country. You have to have a big population in some way to generate, and you have to have a government that has energy. And
that's right.
That has the
people.
It's impossible to escape the sense that this is an exhausted government in Canada and morale is low, despite all the brave faces.
All of that is true. And there's one other element, which is the one thing that I think this government feels confident in is its ability to manage the Trump administration because they felt that they did a decent job the first time around. But I think that could actually end up being a vulnerability, because if you feel like you know how to do something, the overconfidence, because I think for all the things that we talked about, Trump 2.0 is going to be different. So whatever playbook worked for Trump 1 may not work this time around.
Canada could be looking at a much more uncertain 21st century than what we imagined we were going to be seeing.
But which means, again, as a new Canadian, as a proud Canadian, what this makes me think of is that we have to invest in ourselves. We have to focus on Canada becoming really much more of a independent, prosperous country. We are an energy superpower. We're a food superpower. We have so much going for us. And I think for a while now, we've been coasting because we've been very comfortable. We've been very privileged. And this is hopefully a wake-up call, because there's no reason why Canada can't be much more capable, I guess, or much more strategic in the way it engages with the world and in the way that it leverages its own strength.
We have more leverage than we imagine. And I think maybe our complacency has become kind of our enemy here, in that we've had the ruby slippers all along, as you say. Yeah. And in some ways, I think maybe this is the point. Especially our liberal instincts have been to be Canada as human rights champion, Canada as a player on the international stage. And we have resisted the ruby slippers that we've been wearing all along, which is that we are a resource powerhouse. And energy doesn't have to be just oil and gas. Yes. We could be a renewable energy powerhouse if we turned our minds to it. So I do think of it as we do have this strength, and maybe it is time for us to consider pivoting to this strength. And on that note...
Yes, more optimistic note, that maybe this crisis is an opportunity. I mean, we have to hope for it.
Yeah, as a door closes, a window opens. It's going to be a big, big challenge. The future is going to be very different from the past. Thank you, Vina Nadjibulla, for a wonderful podcast, and look forward to many future conversations that we will be having now because of what's happened.
Indeed. Thanks so much. Great to speak with you again, Sandy.
This has been a Teeny Turner production in collaboration with Canada's National Observer. Engineering and sound design by Eric Chapman. Like and subscribe on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. And give us a rating. That's how we build an audience. And why not subscribe to Canada's National Observer? That way you won't miss a thing.